On the surface, the town of Rockledge in Brevard County, Florida, hardly looked like the backdrop for a crime that would soon horrify the entire nation. Founded in the late 19th century, Rockledge grew slowly over generations. Unlike larger metropolitan areas nearby, it remained a modest, suburban community defined by small businesses, family homes, and quiet neighborhoods. Its character was shaped by the rhythm of everyday life: children walking to school, families gathering for church, neighbors greeting one another across their lawns. Dramatic headlines rarely came from Rockledge. That stability was what drew families to the area, hoping to give their children a safe place to grow up. But in March 2023, that sense of security would be violently destroyed. At the center of the tragedy was the Terwilliger family, a household that, by all accounts, lived with modest hopes and ordinary dreams. This was not a family chasing status or wealth. They wanted consistency, stability, and a sense of love that would carry them through life's challenges. For years, they had managed to build that kind of home. Yet the balance they had so carefully nurtured would collapse when someone from the past forced his way back into their lives. A man whose presence had always been marked by chaos, violence, and disregard for boundaries. Glenda, the anchor of the home. The Terwilliger household revolved around its matriarch, Glenda Terwilliger, who at 63 years old had taken on a role that many grandmothers share, but few fully receive credit for. She was the quiet backbone of the family, the one who made it possible for everyone else to move forward. Her daughter Constance depended on her. Her grandchildren adored her. And although she didn't seek the spotlight, Glenda's presence was indispensable. She wasn't just the one who cooked meals or folded laundry. She gave the family a rhythm. Morning routines, after-school snacks, bedtime stories. These weren't simply chores. They were rituals of care that gave the children a sense of safety. When their mother was at work, it was Glenda who kept the home steady. Her approach was calm, firm when needed, and endlessly patient. For the two young boys in particular, she was the figure who brought stability to their daily lives. Neighbors often remarked on how devoted she was. She wasn't one for gossip or idle talk. Her life was centered on her family. In many ways, she embodied the quiet, everyday heroism of caregiving, the sacrifices that go unnoticed until suddenly they're gone. Constance, a mother holding everything together, Glenda's daughter, Constance Terwilliger, then 35, carried the primary weight of the household. As a single mother, she worked to provide for her children while also managing the complexities of day-to-day family life. Her relationship with her former partner Michael Watson, father of her two youngest sons, had ended, but she had worked hard to keep their co-parenting arrangement stable and healthy. Constance's parenting style reflected her determination to create trust within her home. With her eldest daughter Kiara, she had built a relationship founded not on authoritarian control, but on open dialogue. She listened, she advised, and she gave her daughter space to grow. For her sons, she provided direction and discipline while balancing their need for warmth and security. Friends described Constance as someone who carried a quiet strength, a mother who managed to keep moving forward despite the challenges of single parenthood. She wasn't naive to the struggles of life, but she believed in protecting her children from chaos, shielding them as best she could from instability. Kiara, a teenager beyond her years at 15 years old, Kiara Terwilliger was described as outgoing, cheerful, and deeply responsible. While her peers might have been consumed with social drama or fleeting teenage distractions, Kiara took on responsibilities well beyond her age. She helped her mother with household tasks, looked after her younger brothers, and provided guidance whenever they faced the everyday struggles of childhood. For the boys, she was more than a sister. She was a mentor, a trusted confidante, and at times a second parent. She helped them navigate school problems, taught them patience, and offered advice that came not from authority but from empathy. They trusted her completely because they knew she listened without judgment. Yet behind her maturity, Kiara was still a teenager who yearned for stability. She dreamed of a normal life, one where family dinners, laughter, and a sense of safety were constants. She was old enough to understand the pressures her mother faced, and she carried herself with the awareness of someone who knew that adulthood was coming sooner than later. Michael Watson, the steady father figure, although Constance's relationship with Michael Watson had ended, his role in the children's lives never diminished. Michael remained a consistent presence for his two sons. He took them to school, met with their teachers, and made sure they felt supported in both academic and personal matters. He wasn't an overbearing father, nor did he try to take control of Constance's household. Instead, he provided the boys with a steady, dependable figure they could count on. His involvement reassured the children that, despite the separation, they still had the love and presence of their father. Michael's consistency created a balance in their lives, showing them that families can adapt and remain strong even through changes. The two young boys, innocents in the midst of conflict. At 6 and 9 years old, the Terwilliger brothers lived in a world shaped by the love of their mother, grandmother, sister, and father. Their lives were filled with school days, simple routines, and the small joys of childhood. They played, learned, and grew under the guidance of the women who cared for them and the steady hand of their father. For them, the home was more than a house. It was a sanctuary, a place where bedtime stories, warm meals, and laughter made them feel safe. But tragically, they would soon become the only surviving witnesses of an unthinkable act, left to carry the memories of that night for the rest of their lives. A stable family, until someone returned by the early 2020s. The Terwilliger household had settled into a fragile but functional balance. Everyone knew their role. Glenda was the caretaker. Constance was the provider and authority figure. Kiara was the older sister who bridged the gap between childhood and adulthood. Michael Watson provided steady paternal involvement for his sons. The boys themselves were happy, secure, and thriving in the structure built around them. But into this carefully balanced world came an intruder from the past. Domenico Gigante, Chiara's biological father. His absence during her formative years had been nearly complete. He hadn't provided financial support, emotional guidance, or even the most basic involvement in her upbringing. By the time Chiara was a teenager, he was essentially a stranger to her. When he resurfaced, he claimed he wanted to make things right. He called, sent messages, and said he wanted to build a relationship with his daughter. On the surface, his words sounded like reconciliation, an attempt to take responsibility after years of neglect. But for the Terwilliger family, his sudden reappearance was destabilizing. Constance, protective as always, approached the situation cautiously. She understood the significance of biological ties, but also the dangers of allowing someone unproven into her daughter's life without boundaries. She established strict conditions: all contact had to go through her. There would be no surprise visits, and any interaction had to respect Chiara's emotional comfort. These rules weren't meant to sever ties. They were safeguards, designed to give Chiara control over a relationship she hadn't asked for. Chiara's guarded response for Chiara. The re-entry of Domenico into her life was unsettling. She had grown up with stability, surrounded by people she trusted. Now, here was a man claiming the role of father without having earned it. She wasn't hostile, but she wasn't eager either. Her replies were short. She often postponed calls. She insisted that communication happen through her mother. This wasn't teenage rebellion. It was self-protection. Chiara instinctively understood that trust is not automatic. It's earned through consistent action. And in her father's case, that history simply wasn't there. The more distance Chiara maintained, the more Domenico pressed. He called more frequently than necessary. He asked invasive questions: where she was, who she was with, when she'd be home. His tone shifted from conciliatory to possessive, his requests becoming demands. He pressured her late at night, insisting on quick responses, growing frustrated when she didn't comply. The warning signs were clear. What had been presented as an effort to reconnect looked increasingly like an attempt to control. And then came the moment that erased any doubt. Crossing the line one day, Domenico asked Chiara to send him photos of herself in a swimsuit. For a teenage girl who barely knew this man as her father, the request was shocking. She didn't hesitate to tell her mother. Constance's response was immediate and firm. She confronted Domenico directly and reinforced the boundaries she had set from the start. No private conversations, no suggestive requests. All communication had to be monitored and appropriate. No exceptions. Instead of accepting the boundaries, Domenico argued against them. He accused Constance of turning Chiara against him, painting himself as the victim of manipulation. But the reality was simpler. He had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Chiara, supported by her family, became more resolute in keeping her distance. She continued to share every inappropriate message with her mother, ensuring there were no secrets. Her choice to stand firm against his manipulation revealed her maturity, but it also deepened his anger. For Domenico, boundaries weren't limits to respect. They were obstacles to overcome. And when he couldn't gain control, his frustration grew into something far more dangerous. The return of Domenico Gigante into his daughter. Chiara's life was not an isolated event. It was the continuation of a long and troubling pattern of behavior that had unfolded over nearly 2 decades. What happened in Rockledge on March 1st, 2023, did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of unchecked aggression, missed opportunities for intervention, and a justice system that repeatedly offered leniency when stronger action was needed. By the time Domenico re-entered Chiara's life, the signs of danger were already well documented. The problem was that no one truly connected them in time. Early violence, domestic abuse in 2005. The first serious warning sign appeared in 2005. At the time, Domenico was in his late teens transitioning into adulthood, and he already had a volatile temperament. That year, he was arrested on charges of domestic violence. The victim, whose name remains protected, reported being physically harmed, and investigators documented injuries that aligned with her statements. On the surface, this should have been a pivotal moment. Domestic violence is a crime that often escalates if left unchecked. The evidence was there, the victim was credible, and the legal system had a chance to hold Domenico accountable. Instead, he was offered a pre-trial diversion program, counseling, supervision, and the promise that if he completed it successfully, no criminal conviction would remain on his record. For Domenico, it was a way out. Rather than confronting the seriousness of his actions, he received a pathway that minimized the consequences. For the victim, it was another example of how abusers often slip through the cracks. For society, it was the first missed opportunity to intervene before the violence escalated further. Escalating behavior. The animal cruelty case by 2008, Domenico's behavior had grown more disturbing. That year, he was involved in a case of animal cruelty that shocked even seasoned investigators. Reports revealed that 2 dogs under his care had died under circumstances that pointed to neglect and abuse. When law enforcement investigated, they uncovered details so disturbing that the county sheriff at the time called it one of the most appalling cases he had ever seen. Animal cruelty is not a minor offense. Studies have consistently shown a link between those who harm animals and those who later inflict violence on people. It is a red flag that should never be ignored. Yet once again, Domenico managed to avoid the full weight of the law. Instead of a prison sentence, he was given 2 years of house arrest and probation. For the public record, it may have looked like accountability. For Domenico, however, it reinforced a dangerous lesson that violence, even at its most disturbing, would not truly cost him his freedom. He could endure the inconvenience of probation and surveillance, but the consequences never matched the harm he caused. Road rage and the machete incident. By 2012, Domenico's violence had moved out of private spaces and into the public eye. Witnesses reported him driving recklessly in an episode of extreme road rage. He swerved dangerously, deliberately creating near collisions with other drivers and motorcyclists. The incident ended when 2 bikers confronted him after a collision. Instead of calming down, Domenico escalated. He went to a friend's house, retrieved a machete, and brandished it while issuing threats. The situation could easily have turned deadly. He was arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment. These were serious charges that could have led to significant prison time. But once again, several of the charges were dropped, and Domenico received another sentence of house arrest and supervision. It was another chance, another lenient outcome, another opportunity for him to learn that he could push boundaries without paying a permanent price. The pattern was unmistakable violence. Arrest, reduced consequences, repeat. Each time, the system failed to recognize the escalating risk. Each time, Domenico grew bolder. A dangerous pattern by the early 2020s. Domenico had built a track record that should have set off alarms. He had harmed a domestic partner. He had killed animals. He had wielded weapons in public. He had threatened others. And yet, he was still free, still able to reintegrate into daily life, and still capable of re-entering his daughter's world with claims of wanting reconciliation. To the Terwilliger family, he was an unsettling presence. To the justice system, he was just another case that had been managed. But the truth was darker. Domenico was not a man who learned from consequences. He was a man who learned how to exploit leniency, how to say the right words to minimize his punishments, and how to keep repeating the same cycle until something irreversible happened. February 2023. The escalation. By February 2023, Domenico's attempts to control Chiara were intensifying. What had started as frequent calls and invasive questions turned into outright harassment. On February 27th, Chiara stayed home from school with tonsillitis. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled, and her family managed the situation as they always did. But for Domenico, the illness became another excuse to intrude. He bombarded Chiara with questions, not just polite concern, but probing inquiries about the exact time of her appointment, who would take her, what the doctor would say. His need for control was transparent. Constance, ever protective, reminded him of the boundaries. All updates would come through her, not Chiara directly. But Domenico ignored these rules. To him, boundaries were challenges to break. On February 28th, around 3:00 p.m., Domenico called again. Chiara, busy at the optometrist's office, gave him only a short reply, saying she'd get back to him later. His response was swift and hostile, a harsh, offensive message that revealed his growing anger. By this point, Chiara had decided she wanted to cut off nearly all direct communication. She restricted her replies to what was absolutely necessary and leaned entirely on her mother for interaction. For her, it was the final confirmation. This was not a father trying to rebuild trust. This was a man trying to dominate her life. The housemate's warning signs inside Domenico's home. His behavior was beginning to frighten even those closest to him. His housemate, Bruce McInnes, had lived with him for nearly 18 years. He knew Domenico's moods, his routines, his patterns of speech. And in late February, Bruce noticed a shift. Domenico began pacing constantly, muttering to himself, and obsessively checking his phone. Every conversation revolved around one name, Chiara. The tension built over hours, spilling into angry outbursts directed at her family. On the night of February 28th, Bruce heard him read one of Chiara's messages aloud, followed by a string of insults aimed at her and her mother. Then, suddenly, his tone changed. He stopped yelling. His voice became calm, almost detached. He said words that made Bruce's blood run cold. "Guess I'll have to go take them all out." It was not a scream. It was not an emotional outburst. It was deliberate. It was matter of fact. It sounded like a decision, not a threat. Bruce froze. He had heard Domenico make outrageous statements before. Threats that fizzled out, angry words that led to nothing. Over the years, he had learned to dismiss much of it as talk. But this was different. The stillness in Domenico's voice, the calm certainty, made it clear he wasn't just venting, he was planning. Missed opportunities. From that moment forward, the warning signs came faster. Domenico repeated his grievances again and again. "No one's listening to me. They turned her against me. Something has to be done." He stopped using names and began referring to them collectively, as though his anger had spread beyond Chiara to everyone in her household. His pacing grew more intense. He reread old messages obsessively. The spiral was obvious. Bruce later admitted he didn't report it because he had become desensitized. He thought it was just more talk. He wondered what exactly he would tell the police. He feared that reporting it might even trigger worse behavior at home. So he stayed silent. It was a silence that would prove costly. Because by then, Domenico's intentions were no longer abstract. He had already begun collecting information, asking precise questions about Chiara's routine, her whereabouts, her schedule. He was no longer seeking reconciliation. He was building a blueprint for violence. The final hours of February. By the evening of February 28th, the elements of the coming tragedy were already in place. Domenico had rejected any supervised involvement with Chiara. He had fixated on her family as obstacles. He had voiced his plan out loud. He had begun timing his actions around moments of vulnerability. The family, meanwhile, continued trying to enforce boundaries. Constance reminded him again communication had to remain open, monitored, and respectful. Chiara withdrew further, keeping her distance. They had no way of knowing that these protective measures instead of calming the situation, only hardened Domenico's resolve. Inside his mind, every refusal, every limit, every delay became proof of betrayal. His twisted perspective reframed the family's caution as an attack against him. By nightfall, he wasn't talking about reconciliation anymore. He was talking about ending it. On the surface, Rockledge remained quiet. Families slept peacefully in their homes, but inside one house, a man was preparing to shatter that peace forever. The final day of February 2023 carried with it no outward sign of the storm about to break. In Rockledge, Florida, the Terwilliger family ended their evening as they often did. Children preparing for bed, adults winding down, and the house settling into the quiet of night. For the family, it was simply another day, marked by the familiar rhythm of school, work, and home life. But for Domenico Gigante, the man who had long been circling on the edge of their lives, the night was filled with something far darker. For days, he had been spiraling, muttering threats, pacing, and fixating on his daughter Chiara. By the time midnight passed into the early morning hours of March 1st, his decision was made. He was not going to be ignored any longer. The attack at 1:19 a.m., surveillance cameras in the neighborhood captured a silver pickup truck pulling into the Terwilliger driveway. The headlights shut off as the vehicle came to a stop. The house was still and dark, the residents asleep. Within moments, the quiet was shattered. Using force, Domenico broke into the home. The lock splintered, the door frame cracked. He entered swiftly, armed and determined. What happened over the next 71 seconds was chaos and horror. Gunshots rang out, 9 in total, echoing through the small suburban street. Neighbors later described waking to faint sounds. Some thought it was fireworks, others dismissed it as nothing unusual in the night. But inside the Terwilliger home, it was carnage. Constance Terwilliger, just 35 years old, was shot near the entryway. So was Michael Watson, the steady father who had remained present for his sons even after his relationship with Constance ended. Both were struck fatally before they could react. Upstairs, Glenda, the family matriarch, was shot as she lay in bed. Cara, the 15-year-old who had fought so hard to protect her boundaries, was targeted separately. Each victim's death carried with it the mark of intention. This was not random violence. It was an execution of rage. In less than 2 minutes, Domenico had destroyed nearly the entire household. The boys' call for help, the only ones spared were the 2 young boys, aged 6 and 9. Awakened by the chaos, they stepped out of their room in confusion. What they saw was a scene no child should ever witness. The aftermath of sudden, violent death in the very home where they had once felt safe. Thinking quickly, the older brother grabbed Chiara's phone. He opened a video call to someone he trusted, a family acquaintance named Michael Bichon. The call connected, and instead of Chiara's face, Bichon saw the frightened expressions of 2 children. Behind them stretched the dark corridor of the house, filled with shadows and silence. The boys pleaded for help, trying to describe what had happened, their voices quivering with fear. Bichon immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He stayed on the call, speaking calmly to them, instructing them to remain in their room, to stay quiet, and to wait until he arrived. As he drove to the house, he kept the line open, checking in every few seconds to ensure they were safe. His composure and swift action likely saved their lives. The arrival of help. When Bichon arrived, the call was still active. He entered the home cautiously, and the horror of what had unfolded was unmistakable. Near the entrance lay Constance and Michael Watson, unresponsive. Upstairs, other victims were discovered. Bichon did not linger. His focus was on the boys. He went straight to their room, gathered them, and shielded them from seeing more than they already had. Carrying them downstairs, he led them out to his vehicle, locked the doors, and kept them closed. Only then did he place the emergency call to dispatchers. He told them plainly there had been a shooting. Multiple adults were unresponsive, but the 2 children were safe with him. He would not re-enter the home. Time was too critical, and he knew the boys' safety was now the priority. At 2:00 a.m., the first patrol units arrived. Their headlights cut across the street, followed by the red and blue flash of emergency lights. The quiet neighborhood stirred as law enforcement secured the perimeter. Paramedics and forensic teams soon joined, and what had once been an ordinary suburban street became a crime scene. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by curiosity and fear. They whispered among themselves, stunned that such violence had erupted in the heart of their community.